Okay, so hopefully you guys can see that. So this is a worksheet, as Sarah mentioned, that we put together to help you in calculating your PPP loan forgiveness. In the questions on the right panel of your screen, we did respond to one individual's question on where this template can be found. So you can follow that link out, and on the right-hand page of the website page that it takes you to, you'll be able to find the download link for this spreadsheet to use on your own. I'm going to walk through just kind of a high level, really kind of how to approach this calculation, how to approach this spreadsheet, and what it's intended to accomplish, really. So if you look to start off with at the page as a whole, there's a number of tabs here. There's a number of calculations that go into this, and it's designed to really mirror the application that the SBA released a couple weeks ago. So these blue tabs that you see down at the bottom, those represent pretty much calculations that are lifted straight from the SBA forgiveness application. And the gray tabs are really tabs that we had to include to kind of support some additional calculations that you'll have to go through to come up with your final forgiveness amount. If you just start and work through this workbook from left to right, you should be able to kind of get to an answer based on what we know now. So there's no magic to which tab you start on. Just kind of walk through it tab by tab. So I'm just going to start here with our instructions and setup tab. So really, we just kind of walk through the overall layout and then give you guys a little bit of detail as to the format indications for data inputs in general. Anything that is in light blue is something that's looking for an input from you. Anything that's in white is a calculated field, and anything that is blue with a hash through it is you don't input right now, Sal, I'll say. So I've kind of pre-populated some data into the tool down in this setup screen, and this really is where you enter a few foundational pieces of information that'll be used throughout the rest of this book. So in our instance, we've got a borrower here that received $1 million in a PPP loan. The loan was funded on 4/25, and again, the blue cells you can input yourself. And then there's a couple other selections that we're making here that I'll go through. In general, the workbook is relatively dynamic, so this origination date that you select or input will kind of flow through to the rest of the workbook, and the date ranges for inputting things like covered costs will kind of be automatically updated. So some of the setup calculations or elections that we kind of select on the front end is whether or not we want to use the simplified FTE calculation. So the application provided a means to simplify how you count FTEs, that being if you have a part-time employee, you can count them as 1/2 employee versus some ratio of what they actually are, and full-time employees can be counted as 1 employee. So selecting this box true will essentially go through this workbook and update your specific inputs for hours worked by employees to either that 1/2 or 1 simplifying election. The second election here that will follow through to the rest of this workbook really is the FTE reduction safe harbor. So if you didn't lay off employees, you would check this box to be true, and it would kind of turn off some of the functionality and save you some data input on the back end. And then finally, to what we had discussed last week, there is an option for selecting an alternative payroll period, starting with the first date of your next weekly or biweekly pay run following the funding of your loan date. You can enter that information here, and then it will auto-populate the alternative payroll date throughout the rest of this book. Turning to these next couple pages, you might recognize this is pretty much lifted directly from the SBA loan forgiveness application, and it follows 99% of that same logic. with some small exceptions for taking into account things that we answered on the previous tab. But this is kind of the primary application where you can see the actual aggregation of all your costs and your payroll costs and your forgiveness amounts, and it will boil down to your actual loan forgiveness amount here. Again, this is pretty much straight off the SBA application. Schedule A is also from the SBA application, and this really is kind of a little bit more detailed aggregation of data that you input or will input on the succeeding tabs that I'll kind of walk through here over the next few minutes. And then moving on to kind of the last piece of the forgiveness application is the Schedule A, Table 1, Part 1. And this is kind of where the heavy lifting starts. So the application really kind of bifurcates your employee base into two components. One being employees that made less than $100,000 on an annualized basis in 2019, and those employees that made more than $100,000 on an annualized basis in 2019. And it has you enter those two populations on two different tables, those tables being Table 1 and Table 2 represented in the tabs in this book. This tab is where you will come in and enter essentially the wages that you paid your employees during the 8-week covered period or alternative covered period, and you will also enter in the hours worked. So again, the net result on this page is going to be what is the cash compensation to employees eligible for forgiveness, and what are the full-time equivalents for use in the calculation if you reduce your FTE headcount. I would start by just entering in an employee per row, and then kind of following again, starting at the left and working to the right of the worksheet, answering questions. And as you answer these questions, the blue cells will change shades from light blue, meaning you can input things there, to a shaded cell, meaning that you don't need to make any inputs based on your prior inputs in previous columns. So I think one of the keys to this tab really is kind of understanding the FTE reduction exception. So the SBA has said if you have an employee that quits or refuses to come back to work or volunteer, or you separate for cause, you're not penalized by those employees, and a reduction in headcount over the covered period. So selecting true for one of these employees in this column will essentially turn off the rest of the data inputs for that employee, so you don't have to spend time entering zeros for things that don't matter. And then what it does is it gives you an input to kind of look up the FTE equivalent of that employee during the reference period, which I'll get to in a couple minutes here. Next column is whether they're an employee is hourly or salary, because that will impact the way that you calculate the forgiveness limitations for a salary reduction. And then the last two columns here are, again, the cash compensation paid during the covered period. So in this case, it's April 30th to June 24th, which is driven by the original input of the date of the loan funding that I talked about on the instructions and setup tab. And then as you'll also input the hours for each employee to calculate an FTE. So this tab, it's Table 1, Part 2 is really Part 2 for Part 1. It starts by replicating the employee inputs that you made on the previous tab, and then walks through a series of questions in the form of columns that calculates the total forgiveness limitations that you would see from your employee base for salary reductions in salary. So it walks through a couple different safe harbors and really looks at Q1, for instance, and what a salaried employee made in Q1, takes 75% of that amount, and then says on an annualized basis, did you pay them essentially that equivalent over the 8-week covered period? If not, it calculates, in the instance of employee number 5 here, a reduction amount based on the percentage that you reduce their compensation below 75% of the amount at February 15th. And then again, this kind of centerpiece here really just walks through any safe harbors. So if you return your employees to full pay by June 30th, again, you would enter in their salary at June 30th or their hourly rate at June 30th, and that would essentially turn off the reduction completely because you would not be subject to it. So again, this section only needs to be considered an input if you made salary reductions to your employees. If you did not, then you don't have to worry about this input page. Moving on to table 2 of the application. This is for those employees that I spoke of earlier that made greater than $100,000 in 2019. For those employees, we're not really worried about the reduction in their salaries because according to the SBA as it stands right now, that reduction just doesn't apply. What we are interested in is the number of hours that they worked as well as the total cash compensation, which will be used in an FTE reduction calculation on Schedule A itself, and also obviously the payroll cost will be aggregated. These just all foot down. Right now, these spreadsheets are set up to support 25 employees just so it doesn't look so overwhelming at first, but if you need more than 25 employees, we're happy to help you out and get a spreadsheet to you that will support your employee base. So moving on to something that is not in the calculation itself, but I think will help you guys, or I hope will help you guys. We prepared a worksheet where you can input the non-cash compensation payroll costs, so things like group health care, retirement, state unemployment insurance, those types of things that aren't run naturally or might not be run naturally with payroll. You could input those in here by week. The Table 1 and Table 2 tabs are really designed with a thought in mind that you'll be working with your payroll provider to run compensation reports and hour reports for the given 8-week period. So you can run those reports, use that as substantiation, and just drop in single numbers for employees. Whereas the non-compensation payroll costs and the non-payroll cost itself, you'll probably be aggregating as you go over the 8-week period. So we kind of provided some space for you to start accumulating this information as you can. And then you could even put in actuals as each week passes and estimates through the end of the 8-week period to kind of track how you're doing and how much forgiveness you might qualify for. These dates again will change based on your inputs for the loan origination date, whether you're using the covered period or the alternative covered period for non-cash compensation costs. And as we move down to non-payroll costs, those are your mortgage interest paid, rent or lease on real and personal property, and your utilities. Those stick with just the strict 8-week covered period. So those dates will also populate accordingly. So the second to last tab is really supporting our calculation for reduction in FTEs. So you would select your reference period, and again, you can use either the effectively 6-month period from February 15th through June 30th of 2019 as your reference period, the 2-month period for the first 2 months of 2020, or if you're a seasonal employee, you can there's functionality for you as well where you can pick your seasonal period start and end. That must be between May 1st and September 15th. But here you would go in and enter by employee the hours that they worked in the reference period that you selected, so that way you can calculate what your baseline FTEs are for your reference period, or that denominator in the equation that is your FTEs during the covered period over your FTEs during the reference period applied to your actual loan amount to figure out what your forgiveness is. And if you recall back on Schedule 1, we had an employee that we selected true, meaning they either voluntarily left or they were fired for cause or they refused to come back to work. We entered a number here. That number correlates to the employee number on our reference period tab, which will essentially look up what his FTE equivalent is and include that number in your final forgiveness calculation. So that way you're not penalized for those folks that qualify for that Fte reduction exception. Finally, we've got a PPP owner compensation support tab. So as you might have noticed, there was no spot to enter owner compensation along the way. And one of the things that became clear when the SBA released the forgiveness application is that owners are really kind of in a pool of their own. So they're really not taken into consideration when you're calculating the FTE equivalents, at least as the application stands now. So here is a space where you can enter in your compensation by owner to be included in potential forgiveness. This is again limited to the consistent $15,385 for the 8-week period. It's the lesser of that, or the essentially average owner compensation over an average 8-week period in 2019. So you can't pay yourself more than you did in 2019. So all of these data input tabs that I just walked through here really work to support and are summarized on this PPP Schedule A tab and the PPP Loan Forgiveness tab. So the Schedule A aggregates all of those costs, being payroll costs, direct compensation and non-direct compensation, as well as non-payroll costs. And here's where your FTEs are calculated and aggregated. And it's kind of the basis for all of your calculations to understand forgiveness. These are then summarized, and the actual calculation is walked through on the primary loan forgiveness application page here. So you can kind of see the amounts that were entered in this sample are kind of collected, and the same logic is followed as on the PPP loan forgiveness application to boil down to, in this case, a $63,684 forgiveness amount. So again, this is kind of available on our website. It is, based on everything that we understand to be now, and will probably change. It's already changed since the first time we released a forgiveness application, based on the release of the SBA forgiveness application itself, and I'm sure it will change a few times here over the next few weeks as additional IFRs are released. But for now, this is kind of as we understand it to be the calculation that's intended. So, Tim or Sarah, are there any questions specifically related to this? Or
yeah. But could you go through that one more time?
Yeah, I want to get right on that.
No. I mean, to me, what's clear is that I think as our participants ask questions or they get through this, hopefully they'll provide us some feedback on, all the information you provided there. The one thing is clear is, and we talked about this before, Ben's entrenched in this spreadsheet and this process, not only in helping us develop a tool for our clients,